Welcome, everybody. If I could have everybody's attention, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our panel. Today, we're going to be looking at creating value in supply chains. My name is Gonen. I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. I am the CEO of Closed Loop Partners. We are an investment firm based in New York City that focuses on investing in the circular economy. We have a venture fund, a project finance fund, a private equity fund, all focused on building circular economy infrastructure and systems. In today's session, we're going to learn about opportunities to generate and extract value out of moving from linear supply chains, extracting resources, manufacturing, and then paying to stick those resources in a landfill or a waste energy facility, and then extracting again. We're going to look at the opportunity from transitioning from that type of system to a system in which you limit the amount that you extract, because after you've extracted once, you continually recycle and reuse that resource. And in doing so, you're also avoiding the cost of sending anything to landfill. With that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started with our conversation. So first, I'd like to introduce Tomas Carlsson and ask you to come up. He is the CEO of NCC, a major construction and infrastructure company. Thank you. Second, I'd like to introduce Prime Minister Mark Rutte from the Netherlands. Thank you. Thank you so much. Third, I'd like to introduce Vyvyan from Dell. Fourth, I'd like to introduce Xianming from Broad Group. And fifth, I'd like to introduce Peder, Holk, Nielsen, CEO of Novozymes. Thank you so much. Please, everybody, go ahead and take a seat. So my first question I'd like to ask Prime Minister of Netherlands. You've been a leader in the circular economy long before it became a term that people were starting to talk about at conferences. And because you've been a leader in the circular economy, there's now this opportunity to export that technology, export that business model. If you could touch on a little bit that economic opportunity for the Netherlands.
Well, I was visiting in Amsterdam a couple of months ago, Denham City, which is a place where students and companies come together to work on finding out more sustainable ways to produce denim. And they use all kinds of techniques. The students are there, the companies are there, and this is a technique which is increasingly also being exported to other parts of the world. Another example would be Philips, the electronics company, which is producing CT scanners, for example. And when we talk about circular economy, we are talking about reuse, how to use again. But there's of course also the issue of how to refurbish and how to, in the design already, make sure that you not only can use the, in terms of e-waste, what comes out of that machine, and to use it again for other purposes, but also how to refurbish the machine itself. And we now see that this technique is being used in, for example, the iPhone industry. And in Africa, I know in Ghana, already 4,000 people are full-time employed because of the fact that this type of technique, not just from the Netherlands, I mean, we are working on this and it helps us in our exports, but Ghana itself also has been working on this. And already 4,000 people are full-time employed in this industry of refurbishing mobile phones. And this is a fantastic opportunity. And we can make sure that they don't make the mistakes we made. And I think that's the most important thing here.
Thank you. Claire, from Dell's perspective, most people think of Dell as a company that makes great laptops and computers. But in reality today, Dell is a much larger and more diversified company. If you could touch on who Dell is today and your footprint in the circular economy and why it's important, that would be great.
Okay, fantastic. So Dell is actually the merger of 8 companies, the first of which is that PC company, which we still do a lot of. But actually, Dell as a company also looks after about 30% of the compute power in the world and stores about 30% of all the data in the world as well. And in addition to that, has a massive software business that helps turn hardware into useful innovation, and two big cybersecurity businesses in RSA and SecureWorks that look after that digital economy and make sure it's secure from all the less well actors in the world. So that's what the company is. As I think about the circular economy, obviously we have a huge global supply chain that fulfills that demand for both governments and companies. And so sustainability and circular economy within our own supply chain is really, really critical. And making sure that everything if you think about the traditional flow, which is you design it, you build it, you use it, you dispose of it. And there's a lot of generations that have learned that supply chain model. Now we try to really shift the model so that we design it right up front so that it can be used and then recycled. You've probably heard on the main stage today the work we're doing with Lonely Whale and the next wave generation, trying to get all the companies in the world to take plastic out of the ocean, which we then reuse in the manufacture of our products. Likewise, we take all the products we manufacture back and we recycle them and we take all the components back off. Interesting fact for you, by the way, there is 800 times more gold on the motherboards of computers than there is in the same equivalent ton of iron ore that you pull out of the ground. So why would you pull iron ore out of the ground if you can take it off products that you've already got? Much more effective. So in our supply chain, we work really hard at that. But also we think that the digital economy is a way to solve the problems of the world. And so as an entrepreneurial company ourselves, we invest a ton of money in other entrepreneurial companies to help try and get them going and solve the problems of the world. And so I could give you hundreds of companies that we've helped start up and work that really do start to drive the whole circular economy and waste and management agenda. We might talk about some of those later.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Tomas, I wanted to ask you, we all walk in and out of buildings every day, we drive on bridges every day, and we oftentimes spend little of that time actually thinking about how it was designed, the materials that were used, the energy that went into it. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about infrastructure and its relationship to climate change, circular economy, and economic opportunities to start building differently.
Yeah. Let me start with a little bit about NCC. In the Nordic region, we are the leading construction company for buildings and for infrastructure. And I think what you just said, reflecting on that a little bit, is that, this is the 100% sector. 100% of all people, 100% of their time is in some way connected to what we have produced. It could be a building where you live or where you work. It could be infrastructure or something like that. But in this context, I'd like to highlight infrastructure because we tend to think only about the buildings when we talk about sustainable cities. But in reality, infrastructure is equally important or even more important than the buildings. And it's a part of the challenge, but it's also a part of the solution. And infrastructure has, admittedly, several challenges from pollution and noise and everything like that, but it's also an enabler for dynamic societies. If you think about the fixed link between Sweden and Denmark here in Copenhagen, between Copenhagen and Malmö, that was born in the pains over environmental concerns, but that has created a very dynamic region here of the Öresund region. So that's one part of it. Infrastructure is also extremely long term. What you decide, it takes a long time to decide. And once you've built it, it will be there for a long time. And then finally, it's a type of project or part of society that really requires partnerships because you need the expertise of so many different parts of society.
Thank you. Xianming, I'd like for you to first give an overview of Broad Group because you have a major presence in China and now starting internationally, and I think what you're doing is really fascinating. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the decisions that you've made as a company, because China is this massively growing economy, and oftentimes in those scenarios, you can have one path to go down, which is just unbridled growth, and we have to keep the economy going. There's another path to go down, which is we need to keep the economy going, but we also need to think about, are we being sustainable? Is the air going to be breathable? Are the rivers going to be rivers that we can fish out of? And your company proactively, a few years ago, decided to be a leader on the sustainability track. And if you could talk a little bit about what that decision-making process was like, and then has it been good for business?
Okay, thank you, Ron. I'd love to do that. So broad in Chinese means far and wide. And what does far and wide mean? It's not only the size of the business. We are a 3,000 employee company, and we were founded 30 years ago. And we started in energy, air conditioning, district cooling, and we're in 154 countries, many projects in the Nordic region as well, dealing with energy efficiency, industrial cooling, but also in waste heat, turning it into cooling and heating. Then in the 2006, we started doing air purification. So we're moving towards more of the because of the growth of China and then the impact of air pollution. Is there a business in there? Perhaps, but in 2006, we're one of the earliest to do air purification. And today, we have one of the most popular selling home air purification unit system in China. Sales on Taobao, Alibaba is #1. And then about in 2008, we started our construction. And in people who are in construction business, probably have seen how Broad has built 57-story tall building in 19 days. So we have accumulated a lot of know-how in green economy. And you ask me now, China's at this fork in this road. And our decision of aligning our business interest with environmental interest, and what has that gained us? Very simple, it has gained us far and wide. It has gained us broader business. It has gained us a future. And actually has gained us a lot of popularity in China. And as you might have heard of the trade war in China right now, there is incredible internal pressure to say, how can we reinvigorate our business? And the best way is really the green way.
Thank you for that. Peder, before I get to the specific question I want to ask you, I think it's important to understand what Novozymes does. I was actually pleased when I was asked to be the moderator of the panel to see your name, because most people think about solar or wind or even our business recycling when they think about climate change and circular economy. But there's actually some low-hanging fruit in another sector and an opportunity to have massive change in a completely another sector, which is really an area that your company is a leader in. And so I think it'd be great to just touch on what your company does and the impact it has. And then I'd like to ask you to kind of look into the future for us and let us know where you think there's going to be some major innovations in your field that'll have great impact.
Thanks for the question. I think we should actually hire you for our PR department. So Novozymes is what are we today? About a 16 billion euro market cap industrial biotech company. And we deliver solutions for a number of different industries around the world. It's a global business, of course. And most of our businesses is about obtaining higher efficiency in the supply chain. So the blue denim that the Prime Minister was referencing is probably done with solutions that we actually provide that helps save water and chemistry and therefore effluent in the processing of denim or for that sake all kinds of cotton fabrics. When we're going to have lunch in a while, all the piglets and chickens around the world, pretty much the entire world, is today fed with biotech solutions, enzyme solutions that actually provides them with, on a good day, 6 to 8% extra nutritional value out of the same food, out of the same feed. So that, of course, reduces the required land for producing that amount of meat with 6, 7, 8%. We are producing solutions that now go on corn and soybeans, primarily in the Americas. That also gives an extra yield with all inputs being the same, an extra yield of between 3 and 5%, depending on how we deploy these things. And I of course, I can go on, but I think the story here is that there's a lot of things where biotechnology gets to play, and it increases the efficiency in the supply chain. I mean, nature is really smart about the way it uses things. Nature is truly circular. So nature is a good place to go looking for these solutions that you can apply in our industrial world and help, and therefore help us all to become more resource efficient, more energy efficient, and generally more sustainable. As a company, I think we in 2015, when the SDGs were developed, we took the SDGs and said, okay, so how can we contribute to reaching the SDGs? And of course, a company, certainly with a kind of mid-size Novozymes cannot reach all of them. We reach some of them, and the mantra is that we try to contribute where we can, and then do no harm or do as little harm as possible on the others. And I think we contribute on a number of them. Actually, we look at the SDGs as an inventory of business opportunities. And we think and hope that companies that will be able to contribute, they also stand to get rewarded for that. Consumers will become more excited about the whole theme of sustainability, and I think more money will start flowing into solutions that are truly more sustainable over the next years. Now, biotech, to get to the second part of your question, I think holds a lot of promise because, first of all, we heard about the digital world. The digital world is exploding now, but biotech is also exploding. We learn so much about nature every time we start looking at it. And you'll meet scientists, you'll meet researchers that believe they know everything, but the truth is that every time we start digging, it turns out that nature is just 10 or 100-fold or 1,000-fold smarter than we thought it was. So there's so much to be lured out of nature, and I think the combination of digital and biology is actually a very strong one that I think will be incredibly powerful in this century, where coal and fossil fuel and chemistry was very powerful in the previous century.
Thank you for that. And I want to just ask you a follow-on question around the flow of capital. One of the positive signs over, I would say, the last 5 to 10 years is some very large financial institutions and pension funds have been very focused on making sure that there's a allocation focus for sustainability, SDGs, circular economy. Have you found that they recognize that biotechnology can actually be a leader in that space? And are you seeing interest from financial markets because you meet those standards and oftentimes can be a bellwether for where things can go?
Financial markets are very diverse. You find financial markets that are really short-sighted, that only cares about what's going to happen next week. And you find financial markets that really cares about creating value on a 5-10-year time horizon. If you look at the latter, they look at sustainable solutions and I think they'll be willing to pay a premium for sustainable solutions. And in particular, they'll be willing to pay a premium for lower risk. And I think when you go and talk to the financial markets today, they are very clear on that companies that contribute to the SDGs, they inherently have lower risk in their business models than companies that do the opposite, so to say. And therefore, it's not expressed in the sense that a company like Novozymes is owned by green funds, but it's expressed in the sense that a company like Novozymes is held by shareholders who think long-term and who attach a value to the lower risk that a company like Novozymes has.
Great. Very helpful, thank you. Thomas, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I want to build on that because I have the same experience that capital markets are very diverse, but they are at its core actually very long-term, even though some of the outward signs are short-term. And what we have experienced that when we have launched more energy efficient buildings and energy saving programs, the people that has paid most attention and that has actually been willing to pay a premium for it is hardcore capital investors, because they understand that they will have a better return going forward, while more idealistic type of customers has not been as interested.
Interesting.
But that is fascinating, because you always would think this is the paradox. You would think that the short term would win and the long term would lose in the end. But here it is completely reverse. So the long-term outlook, and also taking into account the impact you have on the environment, and even maybe trying to have a positive impact, like some of the companies at this table. I guess it also has to do with finding the right partners. One of the things we find in the Netherlands is, in terms of building the circular economy, at this moment 81% of our waste is handled in a circular way, and we are now making this part of our trade missions into China, India, so it is really an export product. But at the same time, having said that, to find the right partners is difficult. A second remark, maybe building on what was said, I would like to add to the discussion is, we are also, when we discuss the Sustainable Development Goals, we are talking about the developing countries. In developing countries, if we can help with our business models to create a circular economy, there is a huge side benefit. Of course, the main benefit is that you have less pollution and less waste in those countries, but at the same time it will have an impact on society in terms of social benefits. The fact that you will have access to affordable goods and services, and as I mentioned just in my example of Ghana a minute ago, that you will also have new types of employment, which is necessary for these developing countries to make the next steps. Particularly now that we are competing with other parts of the world in who will do the most in terms of its effectiveness in developing countries. So there are many side benefits whom some others, I guess, would judge as being the main benefits.
Great, thank you. I'd like to use that as a segue into a conversation on public-private partnerships and regulation. We view public-private partnerships as a necessity to move this forward, and regulation is oftentimes a major inhibitor or a major driver. I'd like to start with Xianming, because China's system is somewhat different than what we have in the United States and what we have in Europe. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how your company views regulation, public-private partnerships, both in China as well as in the other countries in which you operate, and where you see opportunities, and perhaps where you currently see some restrictions and things that could potentially change.
Okay, I think a lot of other Chinese companies would definitely have different opinion than I do, because Broad is positioned in more aligned with this camp, with more about reform. So we're actually pushing for stronger regulations. So Broad has been speaking always. There's a division in the government department called NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, and then they are the DOE of China, for example, Department of Energy. But they also take care of they also do the climate change regulations in China. So we're pushing for stronger and tougher regulations on emissions. For example, this year the government has released an exhaust temperature regulation. So power plants cannot release exhaust that's higher than 40 degrees into the atmosphere. So then we come in, and these are huge power plants all over China that need to recapture that waste heat and turn it into better energy again, different uses. So this is where we come in. And in terms of public and private partnerships, companies like us come into the global conversation is that we used to learn a lot about passive house, then we make recommendations to the government, to the prime minister, and now cogeneration and many energy efficient solutions. And companies like us are speaking directly to the Climate Commission in China. And maybe I cut it there.
Okay, thank you.
You're basically asking for strong targeted regulation that helps your business, you are saying?
Yes, yes.
Claire, I'd like for you to touch on how Dell views regulation and also public-private partnerships. Electronic waste can be very harmful to the environment if it's not handled properly. So if you could just talk a little bit both about regulation as well as opportunities for public-private partnerships.
Yeah, so I think governments and local and both regional and national governments have a huge amount of responsibility to set the tone and to make sure that investment is going into all of the areas around digital cities. So how you manage waste, how you manage traffic, how you manage everything. There are digital solutions for all of those things, and it's for prioritization of those in public agenda items. In terms of the compute itself and the way it comes into the world and goes out of the world, it's incredibly important today that products are designed correctly so that they can be disposed of correctly. And actually in today's world where a lot of technology is bought as a service as opposed to purchased through capital, then actually that's hugely helpful because we, as well as putting it into the market and allowing companies and governments to use it, we also take it out again at the end of the cycle. And that means we own the responsibility for the responsible recycling of it. Whereas when you sell something, the company or the government or the authority that buys it is responsible for its disposal. So the shift of the world to these as-a-services models is really, really helpful from a circular economy point of view because it puts the responsibility back on us as a company to manage the supply chain right through to the end.
Okay, great, thank you. Tomas, you operate in a very, very highly regulated industry, and in many respects for good reason. No one wants to drive on a bridge that wasn't built to spec. But I could see how some of those regulations can oftentimes create undue restrictions, and how some regulations could potentially create incentives. So if you could talk a little bit about your view of regulation in infrastructure where there's restrictions, and if you had a magic wand, what types of incentives would you like to see?
That's a really broad topic. I need to focus a little bit here. But first of all, my experience is that if you really want to have some kind of impact on more sustainable cities and societies, there's only a limited number of things that can influence that. And then you have to understand that we're operating in the Nordic region where knowledge about sustainable solutions is not anymore something that you can differentiate on. It's a given, it's a license to play. You need to be able to provide that type of knowledge. There are three drivers that I feel is important. One is regulation, one is customer demand, and one is if we can actually be more efficient. And if you look at these, all of these can be levers that can help development for a more sustainable society, or they could actually be barriers. So restrictions, for example, I have my favorite example when I talk about circular economy and infrastructure is recycling of asphalt. We all use asphalt as for our roads. If you didn't know it, you all consume 1 ton of asphalt annually. And what we've seen that you can successfully recycle the old asphalt instead of storing it in the woods. And here we see that countries that are actually promoting that has a fantastic development. In the Netherlands, for example, I think you can recycle up to 70% of all the milled, which is more or less a world record. You can recycle a lot in Sweden, while in Denmark and Norway there are regulatory barriers that prevents us from really using all this resource.
To do with the exhaust that comes free when you recycle?
It has to do with that you're not using virgin material again, so you're not using virgin stone material. You doesn't have to use extra oil. You have to heat it less. You have to transport it less.
No, but why Sweden and some others have?
I think it's Sweden is high, rather high. Netherlands is rather high. Norway and Denmark. I think it's you have contradicting objectives of what you do, and the people that are operating the highway administration, and I'm sure that the industry has contributed to that as well by being super conservative. Try to optimize on things they know, and that is the old-fashioned way of doing and not embracing innovation. We estimate for the NCC group that by using, today we use 20% recycled asphalt, we can do 50%, and using more biofuel, we are now saving 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and we could probably double that.
I want to turn to our CEO in the biotech space. And then one of the great things about this panel and talking about public-private partnerships is we actually have a leading prime minister who I'm going to ask to kind of tie up this part of the conversation around regulation and where there's opportunity. So in the biotech space, regulation is critical because there's a lot of benefit in terms of what's introduced, but there's a lot of risk in terms of if the wrong things are introduced, it can create a lot of risk. So if you could talk a little bit about what type of regulation exists in your industry and where you see opportunities to maybe adapt regulation or evolve it to help introduce more innovation in products.
Yes. First, maybe a stupid correction. I actually don't think biotech involves a lot of risk, but there's perceived risk. And of course, I think every business, at least in this part of the world, will fully understand the need for regulating, the need for, on behalf of the public, to regulate how companies what companies can do and what companies can do with their technology. I would actually like to bring it to a different place, because I think now we are, some of us were cruising around the UN General Assembly, and it was clear that while we are progressing in the right direction on a number of accounts, it's just not moving fast enough. And I think that's particularly the case on climate change. So if you think about the world and the changes that we're going to have over the next 12 years, up till 2030 first, and really when you think about climate change, the massive change that has to happen up to about 2050. I don't think these changes will come about with the speed that's needed unless regulators get on board with companies to help scale and promote technologies that actually brings solutions to market. Now, I talked about Novozymes, and I'll be happy to continue that conversation. The technologies we put to market last year with our customers and consumers saved the planet about 76 million tons of CO2. That's 0.2% of global emissions. So you could say, isn't that just within the era of rounding? You could also say, if you just scale that technology another factor of 100, you actually met the Paris Accord. So there are so many technologies. There are also technologies represented in this room on energy efficiency, better use of raw materials in the supply chain, circular economy, that if we brought them to action and scaled them quickly, then I think we actually stand a very good chance of meeting these goals. But it requires scaling quickly, and that's where I think we still have some homework to do on getting, if I can maybe agitate the Prime Minister a bit, get the political courage to actually wrestle with some of the power structures that have been established in the old world that is preventive, in my mind, to moving fast enough into the new world.
Such as? Which power structures would you
particularly
like to kill?
A simple thing like, get me onto my hobby horse now, a simple thing like, in today's world, we still spend more money on subsidizing fossil fuel than we have ever done on subsidizing renewables. So that's just one example.
Okay. Thank you for that. And with that, Prime Minister, I'd like for you to respond to some of the comments you've heard and provide some direction in terms of regulation and where we could go.
I will now give the definite answer to all of this. No, just trying to capture a few of the points made. I think one of the points clearly raised in this discussion is that businesses that adopt a circular model will probably be better prepared for the future than those that don't. That's the paradox with the long-term outlook, the paradox we touched upon earlier. Secondly, when we talk about, also in the context of this meeting on P4G, on how this can help in developing countries, that by partnering, and then the question is how to find the right partners in the supply chain. This is not easy. And the government can help here. but we have to do it together. But when we are able to partner with developing countries, this will have an impact, not just on waste, etc., but also on jobs, on the economy, on how these countries can develop. Now, what does this mean for us? Business, politics, politicians. I think businesses have to be very clear about making sure that circularity is integrated into their concepts, that it is part of the design. Because I think we have to move from reusing to basically refurbishing. This example I mentioned of these Philips scanners, I think, is a good example. This also means that businesses have to be very clear in their relations with politicians and their context with politicians, what type of regulation you need. Then the politicians have to be very careful that we are not just listening to the ones who are in, the big established companies, but also that this regulation will support the startups and the scale-ups, because you have a very big established company, but you might also have an interest in particular types of regulation, not you personally, but we have to make sure as politicians that our work is aimed at opening up the whole of the sector. And then finally, I think your last point was very valid, scaling. How are we going to do that? And how do we make sure that some of the policies we have established as politicians, as political sector, as governments in the last 20, 30 years can be detriment to getting that scaling going. Of course, this 4PG initiative is also there because it will help not only in startups, but also in scale-up projects to get things going between governments and companies and NGOs. Finally, that means that we as politicians have to be daring in terms of, you're totally right, sometimes confronting the traditional interest groups. At the same time, to make use of our convening power. It is my experience that as a politician, when you, as Prime Minister or as a Minister of Economic Affairs or Climate Change, when you try to get together companies and universities and NGOs, they will always come. So when you ask them, let's sit together, let's talk, they will always come. And we may have to make sure that the coffee is there, that we have a roof above that meeting, that there is a nice invitation with the minister signing it. But then the conversation has to start. And I am still amazed about the fact that governments and politicians are unaware of the enormous convening power they have to get that conversation going. And I think in Denmark, the Netherlands, some other European countries, we have experienced the effects and the impact of that. So that would be my summary with some added personal pointers.
Thank you, very informative. I'd like to, in the time we have left, make sure we can get at least one question from the audience. So go ahead. And if you don't mind, please say your name and what company or government or organization you represent.
Thank you. Khalid Benamou, Sahara Wind. It's wind energy and transforming resources. My question is addressed to those economies on accessing virgin material resources. I'm from the African continent. And with renewable energies, we realize that we got a far more efficient way to process these resources locally and participate to a more efficient global economy. So I'd like to ask the panel, what in your view can be done to try to foster that sustainability criteria on accessing even the resource, conditioning actually the access to the resource to a sustainable transformation or more efficient processing into the global economy. Thank you.
Does anybody want to take a first stab at answering that?
I can make it
easier question.
That'll be the next one.
Yeah, right.
Of course, I don't have the answer for it. I think it's absolutely correct to point out Africa as a very, very significant area of interest. I think there's an awful lot of opportunity in Africa, but there's also challenges, of course. We have actually, again, in another partnership under the IMF, the World Bank and United Nations, the program that was also referenced in the concert hall a second ago on sustainable energy for all. We have taken out as a company and run a subsection of that, of course, under the umbrella of Sustainable Energy for All, that deals with sustainable bioenergy, and it focuses entirely on the tropical areas of the world. They are, of course, many of them are emerging economies, and many of them have the same problems as the tropical areas in Africa. But they also have, if you think about biomass, if you think about plant material, that's a very, very smart way of storing sunlight. It's actually the plant, it's the nature's way of storing sunlight. And that sunlight can be released again. And if you look at the productivity you can get in terms of getting fuel or any other kinds of materials out of that in the tropical areas, it beats anything you can do around here. So there's a tremendous opportunity also in Africa and some of the Southeast Asian countries for taking some of that agricultural produce and actually turning it into either bioelectricity or other streams that they can develop businesses around.
Alex, did you?
I was going to go slightly different, actually. I would encourage you to think about the technology that's coming in the world to serve the world. So by 2030, there'll be 100 times more compute power in the world, 1,000 times more data sources in the world coming from millions and billions more endpoints. And so as you think about that, I think a lot of the solutions to the world's problems are in the innovation and the digital agenda, and that's a lot of what we're talking about here today. But then as a massive, massive global compute supplier, we have an absolute responsibility to, both in our own manufacturing and supply chain and in the building of data centers in the world, to do that in a super, super green way, so that as all that power comes to the world to use, to improve the world, that it's coming in a very green and sustainable way, and that's a big focus of my company.
Great, thank you for that. Xianming, did you want to add? Yeah?
Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit about Africa. Chinese people, when we talk about Africa, we talk about infrastructure. That is the Chinese view of Africa. And I like to say is that this conference, this summit, is about partnerships. And yesterday at DI, there's a gentleman from the Ethiopian embassy came to me, and he said, Broad, yes, I know about Broad. I've seen your YouTube videos. So Broad is known for constructing 57 stories, 19 days, and many other buildings. We built hundreds of these. But then many people come to us and ask for our know-how, but then we're really sad because we don't have that many builders. We don't have the network to go into Africa. So very recently is that I have this little, very specifically, I have a little prototype over here, is that we have 500,000 square meter of production capacity for an aerospace stainless steel core material. And then this material is used for infrastructure. It started with us using in our buildings. But at the same time, yesterday I was sitting next to, this is the greatness of this summit, I was sitting next to the CEO of Vestas, and I was explaining to him is that we're also looking into bringing this material. So the partnership becomes not we as ourselves will be the whole stakeholder, but we're really creating a more open model, much like the biotechnology. But what is the physical technology? This thing behaves like a honeycomb, so speaking about biomimetics, but it's going to last much, much longer than our concrete construction today because of stainless steel. And we just finished a building in Browtown. This comes from the bottom of a 4-story building, and it lasts 10,000 years. That's the laboratory test with corrosion that we have tested in our laboratory.
Great, thank you. So a core theme of the circular economy is resource efficiency, and we're coming up on the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to make sure that we respect everyone's resources and efficiency, and so we're going to go ahead and end the panel at the 1 o'clock hour. I'd like to thank our panelists. Could we get a round of applause? Thank you.